Hello and welcome back. All right, so in this lesson, we're going to do a few things. We're going to go over our histogram. I'm going to explain how to read the histogram in order to edit your image and adjust your dynamic range of that image. And then we're also going to go over some of the other sliders here. We're going to talk about contrast. We're going to go over clarity and exactly how that works. And then we'll also talk about vibrance and saturation. So as part of your workflow, depending on if you're going to follow the workflow I provided in a previous lesson or if you're going to create your own, this is what I would recommend for your workflow. Now, in the last lesson, we did the white balance because I wanted to talk about the white balance in regards to RAW versus JPEG, but I wouldn't do the white balance first. The first thing I would do is I would look at my histogram and determine what I need to adjust within that histogram in order to edit my image properly, and then I would work my way down, which would include doing the white balance and then any other adjustments to the dynamic range of the image, and then these three options here, and then I would move on to the next editing panel, which would be our tone curve, then the detail panel, HSL, etc., and then moving from left to right in order to get all the edits done. Now, if I do have developed presets that I want to apply, I would definitely do those first before I read my histogram and do the other edits. So you have to determine in what order you want to do things in order to do them consistently and quickly for your editing process. So we're not necessarily doing all of the different steps in the correct order because I'm trying to give you information about all the different tools and features, and then you can determine if you want to place a specific type of edit before another. But my recommendation again is to work from the top down, left to right. All right, let's go ahead and go over the histogram, and we'll start working on adjusting our dynamic range, and then we'll do our other edits as well. I personally prefer to use the histogram as a means to determine what adjustments I need to make to the dynamic range of my image because all that information is being represented in the histogram. So what exactly do I mean by dynamic range? Well, if we take a closer look at this image has a lot of problems, and as you can see, the shadows are very dark and are missing a lot of detail. And the highlights are showing detail in them, but they're not very bright. So the overall image is kind of flat. And if we take a look at the histogram, it's showing us the information from this image in a completely different way because it's showing it on a graph versus pixels. So the histogram is representing the RGB values of your image, red, green, and blue, and we can see that with the different colors of the histogram. And we also have a gray element of our histogram as well, and that represents the luminosity of our image, which is the brightness and the darkness of our image. So what exactly can we gain from looking at the histogram? Well, there's a couple things. One, we have a gap over here in this part of the histogram, so that means that the information is missing from this area. We also have a spike over here on this side, but it's not completely outside of the histogram. We can actually see a bigger spike in this section of the histogram. So there's information in the blacks and the shadows, but we're not necessarily seeing that detail in the shadows. So the histogram is actually telling us there is detail there. We just have to fix it to bring that detail into focus and to lighten up the shadows in order to see that detail. Now, before we do that, let me show you a little bit more about the histogram. The histogram is made up of different parts. So if we take a look at this area right here, when I hover my mouse over this section of the histogram, it's going to tell you what part of the histogram that is, and that's the blacks or the black points. If I go to the right, we then see this section right here is the shadows, and that's also highlighted by this little gray box right here. And then the center is our exposure, the right is our highlights, and then the far right is our white points. So I know in this image, I need to fix my white points because I have a gap in that section. So ideally, we do not want to have any gaps in our image, but then again, that is based on the type of image you have. If you have a low key or a high key image, then having a gap in the white or the black points may be appropriate for that type of image based on the way that it's lit. But for most images, you're probably not going to want that gap, so we're going to fill in this gap first in order to properly set the dynamic range of this image. So the dynamic range ranges from blacks to whites, and the ideal histogram is having information that goes from the far left to the far right. So anytime you see a gap, that's where you want to start. You want to start by filling in those gaps. Of course, if it's appropriate for that type of image that you captured based on the lighting. The other thing you want to do is you want to check the highlights and the shadows to see if there's detail in that area that you can't visibly see. Well, in the highlights, we can see all the details. In the shadows, we can see by the histogram that there's information there. There's a lot of information there, and it's not being clipped outside of the histogram. If you see a huge spike, if this spike had gone straight up and beyond this histogram, then you know that you're clipping detail in that part of your image. That would be the black point, or the shadows in this case. So if we look at the shadows, we can see it's very dark, but our histogram is telling us something different. It's telling us there's information in there. So by reading the histogram, we know that we need to fix the shadows of our image. Okay, so I did show you the different sections that are made up of your histogram, but check this out. If you come down here to the basic panel, what do we have? We have our exposure, we have our highlights, shadows, whites, and black points. So each one of these sliders is going to adjust or manipulate the histogram based on the adjustments that you make. So even if you're not reviewing the histogram, you are in fact changing the histogram based on the adjustments that you're making. So let's go ahead and fill in the gap for this particular image. Now we can do that adjustment either from this white point slider here, or we can actually do it from our histogram. So if I click in the white section right here and then move it to the right, we can see that the histogram is starting to stretch out and fill in that gap. So you want to keep going until it reaches the edge of the histogram. So right there we have plus 32. Now keep in mind, anytime you stretch your histogram, you begin to degrade the image if you go too far. So to see if you've clipped any data and you've over edited the image, you can turn on your clipping masks. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the white and the black points. And we can see that there's no mask for the white points. There's like a little dot right there, but that's fine. Now, if we take this all the way to the right, we can see that we're clipping data in this area represented by the red mask, and then you can see this spike right here. So that spike is telling you you're losing data or detail in that area. So that's one way of determining if you've gone too far. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 0, and I want to share with you another quick tip. If you hold down your Alt or Option key and then click on the white point, your image turns black. So right now, your entire image has detail in the white point areas. When you start to move it to the right, you can see that nothing is really happening. But once I pass plus 32, we can see that red color in the image right there, and that is telling you that you're starting to clip data or losing detail in your white points. And the farther you go, the more the red mask appears, and you can see once you release the Alt or Option key that the red mask is left behind, and that's showing where you're clipping that detail. So that's another way of determining if you're over editing your image. Now we can do the same thing with the black points. If I hold down my Alt or Option key and then click on the black slider, we can see that the image turns white, but there's color pixels there already. So that means that the black points are already set properly because we are already losing detail in that area. But I'm okay with losing detail in that area because that's represented by the shadows over here in the trees and the shadows under the boats. So there's no need to clip more data. Otherwise, we're going to lose more information or details in those areas. I don't want to do that. So there's no reason to set our black points. So we're going to keep our black points set to 0. So right now we have plus 32 on the whites, 0 on the blacks, and our white and black points have now been properly set. Now the other thing we need to do, because we've read our histogram, is we need to add detail back in the shadows. So we're going to use our shadow slider and we're going to increase it in order to bring back some of that detail in the trees. And guess what? we can now see we have some houses and some rocks over here. If we zoom in, we can actually see information was actually in there, and we only knew that because we read the histogram. If you continue going, you can bring back more detail, but the more detail you bring back, the more you degrade the image. So again, this is why it's important to nail the exposure in camera in order to have the highest quality image possible. You can see there's a lot of noise and digital artifacts in the shadows, but at the same time, when I did take this photo, I think it was about 10 years ago with the Fuji S2, the dynamic range of that camera was not very good. It was a low quality camera at that time compared to what we have nowadays, and the camera that I use today will better capture the full dynamic range of a scene compared to this image. But I chose this image because I wanted to show you how to read the histogram properly to see if you have details in the shadows or the highlights that you can bring back. I'm not going to go that high. I'm going to go about plus 55. Actually, let's go back to plus 60 because I want more of these details in the house and the rocks. And we're going to go ahead and fix the digital noise and remove some of the digital artifacts in an upcoming lesson of this section. Okay, so now that you have your dynamic range fixed, you then have to decide, do I need to increase or decrease the exposure? I would say no, because right now we have a full set of information from left to right. We don't have any spikes in the exposure section, so we don't need to reduce the exposure. Otherwise, it's going to be too dark and we'll start losing detail in the shadows again, and I don't want to go brighter because then I'll start losing detail in the highlights. Now at this point, the overall image is pretty flat, so we could increase the contrast to help make the image pop a little bit more, but I prefer using my tone curve versus the contrast slider, and that's because with the tone curve, we have more control over the contrast in our image because we can adjust the contrast in the highlights and the shadows. And then if you compare that to the contrast slider, which only applies edits globally, which means you have less control over how much contrast is being applied in certain areas of your image. Okay, so the next slider we have is our highlight slider, and this would be to bring back detail in the highlights or to tone down the highlights. Right now, we have lots of information in the highlights, and there's no reason to fix it because there's nothing to be fixed. So the next option would be clarity. Now, clarity makes your image appear to be sharper, but it's not really a sharpening tool. What clarity does is it adds contrast to your image, but it's different versus the contrast slider and the tone curve, and this is how it's different. Your contrast slider is applying adjustments globally. So in other words, it's applying contrast to your shadows, your highlights, and your midtones. Clarity, on the other hand, is only applying contrast to the midtones, which gives it the appearance of sharpening your image. Now you can also control the contrast of your midtones with your tone curve, but I prefer to use the clarity slider for that, and then I will adjust my contrast for my highlights and my shadows with the tone curve. So again, this is just another method of editing that I prefer, and you have to decide what's best for you, and the only way to decide what's best for you is to experiment with these different sliders to determine what type of edit style you prefer versus what you may be learning from me or from somebody else. So as far as clarity goes, I will typically go between plus 10 to plus 15 for landscape images. And if I have people in my photos, I'm going to go maybe plus 5 to plus 8 at the most. If you do too much, at least in my opinion, I don't like that effect. So that's why I keep it within those ranges. Again, you're going to have to decide for yourself. So we're going to go plus 10 on the clarity. So the next part of our basic adjustments is to decide if we need to increase the vibrancy or the saturation or both. So saturation is a global edit that's going to adjust all the colors in your image, and vibrancy will also increase the saturation of the colors in your image, but it does it slightly differently. And here's how it's different. Our saturation slider is applying adjustments to your shadows, highlights, and midtones, and vibrancy is only applying adjustments to the midtones. So it's very similar to clarity, and saturation is similar to contrast in that it's a global edit. So if we increase the vibrancy, it's only affecting the midtones of our image. So right now I'm going to go ahead and leave these both set to 0 because we're going to do some other adjustments in our custom edit in order to increase the vibrancy of our image. So that's it for our basic edit or our clean edit. And overall, the image is better. If we take a look at our before and after here, you can see we've increased the contrast just a little bit and the color saturation a little bit. Plus we brought out some details in the shadows that we couldn't see before. But overall, the image is still pretty flat and pretty boring. And that's why we're going to do a custom edit on this particular image as well, because I think we can greatly improve this image versus the one straight out of camera and what we've done thus far. All right, although our tone curve is part of our clean edit, we're going to go over making our tone curve adjustments in the next lesson because this one's getting a little bit long and we have a lot to cover with the tone curve, so we're going to cover that in the next lesson.